A note before we start. You may have seen videos online claiming Joel Osteen has been sentenced, arrested, or has said his final goodbye. As of today, none of that is true. He is still preaching weekly at Lakewood Church. This script sticks to what's actually documented. His real history, his real controversies, and the real criticism that has followed him for 2 decades. That story is dramatic enough on its own. To understand Joel Osteen, you have to start with a man who was never supposed to become the reason Osteen exists at all. His father, John Osteen. John Osteen was born in Paris, Texas, in 1921, and by the time he was a teenager, he had already committed himself to the ministry. He built serious academic credentials for a Southern Baptist preacher of his era, a degree from John Brown University, a master's from a Baptist seminary, and later an honorary doctorate. On paper, he was on a conventional path, ordained, credentialed, settled into the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention. His personal life was less conventional. His first marriage ended in divorce while he was serving as a pastor, which was its own quiet scandal in the Baptist world of the 1950s. He remarried in 1954 to a woman named Dodie, and together they began building the family that the public would eventually come to know. The pivotal moment, the one that reshaped everything that followed, including the church Joel Osteen would one day inherit, happened in 1958. John and Dodie's newborn daughter, Lisa, was born with a condition resembling cerebral palsy. For a Southern Baptist minister steeped in a fairly traditional, structured theology, this kind of personal catastrophe often produces a crisis of faith. For John Osteen, it produced a reinvention. He described what happened next as a personal encounter with the Holy Spirit, a charismatic experience that pushed him toward Pentecostal-style worship, divine healing, and a theology built around expectation of God's intervention in daily life. It was too big a shift for the Southern Baptist Convention he'd been ordained under, and he left it. Out of that rupture came something new. On Mother's Day, 1959, John Osteen founded a church in a rundown, abandoned feed store on the edge of Northeast Houston. It was called Lakewood Baptist Church at first, though the word Baptist wouldn't survive long. The congregation would soon drop it and become non-denominational, a decision that mirrored John's own theological journey away from the tradition he'd been raised in. About 90 people showed up to that first service. There was nothing about that number or that building that suggested what Lakewood would eventually become. But it grew, steadily, then dramatically. By the late 1970s, weekly attendance had crossed 5,000. In the late 1980s, the church broke ground on an 8,000-seat sanctuary. Houston was watching one of its churches turn into an institution. Joel Osteen grew up inside all of this, the fourth of 5 children, watching his father build something enormous out of almost nothing. But here's the detail that surprises most people who only know Joel Osteen as a smiling television preacher. He had no interest in the pulpit. None. He enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television communications, not theology. He dropped out after a single semester and came home to Houston, not to preach, but to help build his father's television ministry from behind the camera. For the next 17 years, from 1982 until 1999, Joel Osteen was a producer, not a preacher. He built out Lakewood's broadcast operation, helped turn a local station into a serious regional player, and got his father's sermons on television sets in dozens of countries. He traveled internationally with his father. He watched his mother and his sister step into the pulpit to preach on multiple occasions. He never did. This matters for understanding what came later, because so much of the criticism aimed at Joel Osteen over the following decades assumes a kind of calculated showman who engineered his own rise. The actual record suggests something messier and, honestly, more human. A son who spent most of his adult life avoiding the family business, only to be pulled into it by circumstances he didn't choose. His siblings, meanwhile, took a wide range of paths, none of which pointed toward Joel as the obvious heir apparent. One brother became a surgeon in Arkansas, a career about as far from television ministry as it's possible to get. One sister survived a genuinely frightening incident in 1990 when a package sent to their father turned out to contain a pipe bomb. She was injured but survived, and later went on to become an associate pastor at Lakewood herself, which arguably made her, not Joel, the sibling who looked most likely to eventually lead the church. Another sister married a fellow pastor. The youngest became a motivational author and speaker in her own right, working in a genre not too far removed from what Joel would eventually build his own career around. Joel, the quiet one who preferred sitting behind a camera to standing in front of a congregation, was in some ways the least likely of the 5 children to end up as the public face of the family's ministry. There's another family story that shaped Lakewood's identity long before Joel ever took the pulpit, and it's worth including because it explains so much about the church's theological DNA. In December 1981, Joel's mother, Dodie Osteen, was diagnosed with metastatic liver cancer after weeks of hospital testing. It was actually her son, then a medical student, who first noticed the jaundice that led to the diagnosis. Dodie chose not to pursue chemotherapy. Instead, the family leaned entirely into prayer, and she later said she experienced a complete divine healing. She published a book about the experience in 1986 called Healed of Cancer and lived for decades afterward, eventually passing away in the summer of 2025 at the age of 91. Her son, the surgeon, later told a reporter that he'd personally reviewed her scans and biopsy results and didn't believe it had been a misdiagnosis, that people with that kind of cancer simply don't typically survive it, in his professional opinion. Whatever conclusion you draw from that, the healing story became foundational to Lakewood's entire theological identity, an institution literally built from its earliest years around the idea that God intervenes directly and dramatically in people's physical lives when they have enough faith. Joel Osteen's later emphasis on positive expectation and divine favor isn't really a departure from his family's theology. It's a continuation of it, translated into a more secular, self-help adjacent vocabulary that could travel further beyond traditional Pentecostal and charismatic audiences. Those circumstances arrived in January 1999. John Osteen, whose health had been declining for years with heart and kidney problems, asked his son one more time to preach a Sunday sermon. Joel said no, the same answer he'd given for most of 2 decades. Then, according to his own later retelling, he called his father back within minutes and changed his mind. On January 17, 1999, 35 years old, reportedly wearing a pair of his father's shoes for reassurance, Joel Osteen delivered his first sermon to a congregation of around 6,000 people. His father listened by phone from a hospital bed. 6 days later, John Osteen died of a heart attack. He was 77. Joel Osteen has talked publicly many times about how strange that timing felt to him, that he happened to step into the pulpit for the first time in the final week of his father's life. Whatever you make of that, it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. A man who spent 17 years avoiding the spotlight was suddenly, involuntarily, at the center of it. Osteen was formally installed as Lakewood's senior pastor later that year, with his wife Victoria named co-pastor. And by his own account, his first instinct was to imitate his father, same intensity, same delivery style. It didn't work. Congregations can tell when a preacher is doing an impression of someone else, and Osteen apparently sensed it too. The turn came a few months in. He's described landing on a particular scriptural idea, that his father had fulfilled the purpose God had for his generation, and that Joel's task wasn't to replicate that but to find his own. Whatever the spiritual mechanics of that realization, the practical effect was enormous. Osteen stopped trying to sound like a fire and brimstone Pentecostal preacher and settled into something distinctly his own, an upbeat, relentlessly positive, almost motivational speaker cadence that had far more in common with self-help literature than with traditional sermon delivery. It worked in the sense that it grew the church at a pace that startled even people inside it. The 8,000-seat sanctuary his father had built stopped being big enough. In 2001, Houston City Council approved a deal letting Lakewood move into the former Compaq Center, the arena the Houston Rockets had played in for decades before relocating to a new downtown venue. The numbers involved were staggering for a religious institution. Tens of millions of dollars in prepaid rent, tens of millions more in renovation costs financed through a large bank loan, on top of proceeds from selling Lakewood's old building. In the summer of 2005, Lakewood opened in its new home. The former basketball arena, sitting on several acres near a major Houston freeway, became the largest church sanctuary in the country, with reported weekly attendance in the tens of thousands across multiple English and Spanish language services. By most counts, it remains the largest single congregation in America. Around the same period, Osteen's identity shifted again, from local megachurch pastor to a genuinely national brand, and this is where the criticism that follows him to this day really starts to take shape. His first book, published in 2004, became a runaway bestseller, reportedly spending well over 2 years on national bestseller lists and selling millions of copies worldwide. It was followed by a string of other titles, each one landing at or near the top of bestseller charts, each one reinforcing the same basic pitch. God wants you to succeed, to be happy, to expect good things, and faith is largely a matter of maintaining the right mental and emotional posture toward the future. It's a message that resonates with an enormous number of people, and it's also the exact message that has drawn the sharpest theological criticism of his career. Criticism we'll get into in detail shortly. The scale of his publishing career is genuinely hard to overstate. His follow-up book, released in 2007 through a major secular publishing imprint rather than a religious one, reportedly came with an advance north of $8.5 million, with some industry estimates putting the total value of that book deal, once royalties were factored in, at somewhere around $13 million. The first printing alone ran into the millions of copies. Over the following 2 decades, Osteen would go on to place 7 different titles at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, a run matched by very few authors in any genre, let alone religious nonfiction. In total, he has published more than 25 books, with new titles continuing to appear as recently as 2025. Very few pastors in American history have built anything resembling this kind of secular publishing footprint. The closer comparison, in commercial terms, is to a self-help or business motivation author than to a traditional religious writer. His media reach extends well beyond books. His weekly broadcasts have run on major religious television networks and, notably, on a mainstream cable news network as well. An unusual crossover for a preacher, reflecting just how far his audience extends beyond people who would describe themselves as regular churchgoers. Estimates place his broadcast reach at something like 100 million households across the United States and viewers in over 100 countries. His social media following runs into the tens of millions across platforms, making him one of the most followed religious figures in the world in a purely numerical sense, regardless of what anyone thinks of his theology. Financially, the book deals were transformative. Reported publishing advances for his later titles ran into the millions of dollars, and in 2005, not long after his career as an author took off, Osteen announced he would stop drawing his roughly $200,000 annual salary from Lakewood Church entirely, choosing instead to support himself through book royalties and speaking fees. He's framed this publicly as evidence that he never wanted ministry to be about a paycheck. Critics have framed the same decision differently, as a savvy way to deflect scrutiny of his personal wealth away from the tax-exempt institution he leads, while that wealth kept accumulating through channels that don't require the same disclosures a church salary technically could invite. Estimates of his personal net worth have circulated widely in the press and online. Commonly cited figures put it somewhere around the 9-figure mark. But it's worth being honest about something here. Fact-checking organizations have repeatedly noted that these headline net worth numbers rarely trace back to verifiable primary sources like tax filings or audited statements. Because Osteen leads a religious nonprofit, Lakewood isn't required to make the kind of public financial disclosures that, say, a publicly traded company or even most secular nonprofits must file. That opacity is itself one of the recurring threads of criticism against him, and we'll return to it. What is well documented, because it involves public real estate records, is his home. In 2010, Osteen and his wife purchased a large historic estate in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood, one of the most expensive residential areas in the city, for a purchase price north of $10 million. Current market estimates put its value considerably higher than that. The property is held through a trust, which affects how it's taxed, and the couple also retained ownership of their previous, smaller home. Here's where the story gets less about theology and more about basic institutional accountability, and where a lot of the durable criticism of Osteen actually lives. A nonprofit watchdog organization that rates religious ministries on financial transparency gave Lakewood Church one of the lowest scores it hands out, essentially an F, with a donor confidence rating in the single digits out of 100. The core issue isn't necessarily that anyone has proven specific wrongdoing. It's that Lakewood, like most churches in the United States, is legally exempt from the public financial disclosure requirements that apply to other large nonprofits. There's no legal obligation for the church to publish detailed financial statements, executive compensation figures, or a breakdown of where the roughly $90 million a year it takes and actually goes. Investigative reporting, including reporting from Houston's major daily newspaper and international financial press, has estimated that a very small fraction of the church's annual income, commonly cited as somewhere around 1%, goes toward direct charitable giving outside the church's own operations. The rest funds the church's own programming, staff. Lakewood reportedly employs several hundred people, and its enormous television broadcast operation, which alone has been estimated to cost tens of millions of dollars a year to maintain, reaching an estimated 100 million households across more than 100 countries. None of that is illegal. Churches are allowed to spend their money on their own operations, and American law gives religious institutions wide latitude specifically because the First Amendment discourages government oversight of how churches run themselves. But the gap between legal and transparent is exactly where Osteen's critics have set up camp for 20 years, and the specific incidents below are why that criticism has stuck. It's a useful contrast to note that Lakewood isn't unique among American megachurches in refusing outside financial disclosure. Most large independent congregations operate under the same exemption, and most receive similarly poor transparency ratings from the same watchdog groups. What makes Lakewood a bigger target for this specific criticism is simply its scale. As the largest single congregation in the country, with the largest broadcast footprint and the most commercially successful pastor-author in the business, it draws more scrutiny than a mid-sized regional megachurch would, even when the underlying practices, minimal outside disclosure, heavy reinvestment in broadcast infrastructure, a pastor supported primarily through non-salary income, are fairly typical. For the genre, being the biggest example of a common pattern is, in effect, its own kind of exposure. In March 2014, Lakewood reported that roughly $600,000 had been stolen from a safe at the church, a combination of cash and checks collected over a single weekend of services. A reward was offered. Nobody was ever arrested. The church collected on its insurance claim, and, for most people, the story ended there. Then, in November 2021, more than 7 years later, a plumber working on a bathroom fixture inside Lakewood pulled apart some tile and insulation and found roughly 500 envelopes stuffed inside the wall, containing cash, checks, and money orders. Houston police later said evidence from the recovered checks suggested this cash was connected to the original 2014 theft. A theory offered by a Lakewood executive was that someone had tossed the money up into a ceiling space intending to retrieve it later, only for it to fall down inside a wall cavity where it became unreachable. By the time it was found, the statute of limitations on the original theft had expired, so no charges were ever filed against anyone. It's one of those stories that sounds almost too strange to be real. Money vanishing from one of the wealthiest churches in America, then turning up years later stuffed inside a bathroom wall, with no resolution and no one ever held accountable. It became a recurring punchline in coverage of the church, less because of any proven misconduct and more because it captured, almost too neatly, the broader public unease about how little anyone outside Lakewood actually knows about where its money goes. In 2020, during the pandemic shutdown of in-person services, Lakewood applied for and received a federal Paycheck Protection Program loan of roughly $4.4 million. Reportedly one of the largest PPP loans issued to any organization in the Houston area, intended to cover the salaries of the church's several hundred employees. When this became public in a Houston Chronicle report at the end of 2020, it triggered real backlash, a wave of public anger amplified on social media under hashtags calling for churches to lose their tax-exempt status, aimed at the idea that one of the richest congregations in the country was drawing from a relief fund designed to keep small businesses afloat. Lakewood's defense was that the shutdown created genuine financial uncertainty and that the funds were used to keep full salaries and benefits flowing to employees during a period when in-person giving had presumably dropped. Eventually, facing sustained criticism, the church chose to repay the loan in full rather than seek forgiveness. An unusual move, since most PPP recipients simply had their loans forgiven under the program's rules. If there's one single event that most damaged Joel Osteen's reputation with the general public, more than any theological argument, more than any financial controversy, it's what happened during Hurricane Harvey in August 2017. Harvey dumped historic amounts of rain on Houston, becoming one of the costliest natural disasters in American history. The day after landfall, Lakewood posted on social media that the church itself was inaccessible due to flooding, and it pointed displaced residents toward other shelters around the city. That statement collided almost immediately with photos and videos circulating online that appeared to show the exterior of the building looking dry and reachable, not underwater. Whether or not the interior was genuinely affected, Lakewood later said parking garage flooding had activated protective floodgates and pointed to earlier flooding the building had experienced in 2001. The optics were brutal. Within a day, the story wasn't really about flooding logistics anymore. It was about a wealthy 16,800-seat institution seemingly hesitating to open its doors to displaced families during a historic disaster, while a Houston furniture store owner with far fewer resources had already opened his showrooms to evacuees and sent trucks out to rescue stranded people. That comparison, Osteen against the furniture salesman who became a folk hero almost overnight, is the frame that's stuck in the public imagination, and it's arguably still the single thing most people associate with his name today, years later. The timeline is worth walking through carefully because it shows how quickly a single social media post can outrun any amount of later clarification. Harvey made landfall on a Saturday. Lakewood's statement about being inaccessible went up the following day, a Sunday. By Monday, commentators and critics online, including at least one economic policy writer who pointedly noted Osteen's estimated personal wealth alongside the size of the arena sitting seemingly empty, had turned the story into a full-blown social media storm. Lakewood issued a clarifying statement that evening insisting the church had never actually closed its doors and would serve as a distribution center, ready to shelter people once city and county shelters reach capacity. It wasn't until Tuesday, 3 days after landfall, that Lakewood actually opened for sheltering displaced residents. In a disaster where every day mattered enormously to people who had lost their homes overnight, a 3-day gap between inaccessible and open was more than enough time for public opinion to harden. Lakewood did eventually open as a shelter a few days later, and several hundred people ultimately took refuge there, with hundreds of volunteers helping out. That part of the response was real. But the damage from those first 48 hours never really got undone, partly because of a handful of comments Osteen made while doing media appearances to defend himself. In one interview, he suggested that if the church had housed a large number of evacuees and then experienced flooding itself, that outcome would not have been a good story, a comment that read, to many people, as prioritizing the church's public image over the practical need to shelter people immediately. He later acknowledged, in a more reflective moment, that knowing what he knew afterward, he would have moved staff and supplies into the building before the storm even made landfall. A week or so later, preaching to his own congregation, he told them that God had known Houston could handle the hurricane, and that people should stop being upset by something they were capable of handling. A line that, for a city still pulling water out of its homes, struck a lot of people as strikingly out of touch. To be fair to him, a well-known entertainer publicly defended Osteen during this period and made a substantial personal donation to Harvey relief efforts, a portion of which went to Lakewood specifically, describing the Osteens as good people. That defense existed. It just didn't travel nearly as far as the criticism did. Long before Harvey, long before the PPP loan, long before the bathroom wall money, there was a more fundamental argument being made about Joel Osteen. Not about his church's transparency, but about whether his entire theological project is actually Christian in any meaningful, historically recognizable sense. This criticism comes almost entirely from within conservative and evangelical Christian circles, not from secular commentators, and it's worth taking seriously on its own terms rather than dismissing it as noise. A theology professor, appearing on a national television news magazine broadcast in 2007, summarized his objection to Osteen's preaching in a phrase that stuck. He called it a cotton candy gospel, sweet, insubstantial, dissolving on contact. His argument was that Osteen's message essentially reduces Christianity to an assurance that God is nice, you're nice, so be nice, pulling comforting, personally affirming promises out of Scripture the way a fortune cookie dispenses generic encouragement, while leaving out anything about sin, judgment, repentance, or sacrifice.